It was that farmer coming to speak here that was the kernel that instigated this whole idea in this conference. And as it turns out, it was impossible in the end, but what grew around it has happened anyway. So firstly, I'm very thankful to Peaceboat, the organization who arranged that. They drove to Narita Airport at 1 o'clock in the morning to catch him on the way somewhere else so that they could record that specifically. I think something that really comes through there is a failure to learn. There was a failure to learn from previous experiences, and to me that's a very positive thing about us being here today. We're going to hopefully not make that mistake. We are going to learn from what's happened. And I think that's also, for me, a really positive thing about Mr. Pillay being here and the city being represented. And once again, I'd just like to express my appreciation of that. Just before I left for Japan, I thought I might try and get some potassium iodate because I heard that that was good for protecting one from radiation. So I went to 3 different chemists. None of them knew what I was talking about. The first one said, we receive no training in radiation, so I'm sorry, I can't help you. Next, please. The last one I went to, I got a bit more insistent, and he said, well, let me look up for you. So he went to his computer, and I looked over his shoulder to find that he was in Google looking for radiation protection iodine. And eventually he said, oh, here it is. Yes, I see. It's potassium iodate, and you need so much. So I said, thanks, can I buy a bottle? And he said, no, we don't keep stock. So no chemists in Cape Town keep stock of this. So that was quite an interesting little wake-up call for me. They said, go to the, the municipality should have some. You can get it from there. Now, although I'm expressing my appreciation for the city, it's very unfortunate that Eskom haven't shown the same willingness to participate in this process. And they were given an invite about 4 weeks ago, and after 3 weeks of deliberation, they decided it was unnecessary to come and talk to us. What we did do is we've been involved in a 2-year battle to get the emergency plan out of Eskom specifically, and eventually they did release it, and we have it here. It was released to us in December last year. Unfortunately, it's not very detailed, and you're all welcome to have a look. It's also on our website. And the one thing, it simply refers to another document which is in the ambit of the City of Cape Town, the responsibility of the City of Cape Town, and that document is called the Evacuation and Relocation Plan. So that's something that is not really Eskom's responsibility, that's the City of Cape Town's responsibility. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Greg Pillay, who's a manager in the disaster risk management of the City of Cape Town. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, what Peter had indicated is the Kuba Nuclear Emergency Plan is in actual fact belongs to Eskom, the Kuba Nuclear Power Station. I will be speaking to you about the procedures that we have in place in the city to respond to the plan. I just wanted to put that into correct context. I think what I would like to start with is that we have a set of procedures, that is, and there's a number of issues, etc., that deal with how we would counter and how we would deal with a radiation emergency. Now, the objective of the procedures is, as indicated there, it's to describe and manage the administrative arrangements that have been made with the city to safeguard the public and to minimize the public consequences of any accident at Kuba Nuclear Power Station. And the procedures as such encompass any accident which results in or may result in the release of radioactive material which could present a hazard to the public. I must just say to you, the last 2 presentations were, I listened very attentively. One is always open to learning. This is certainly my view. And one could certainly learn, from the mistakes that made previously. So one would always be open to learning. And I think certainly in our instance, there is a look at reviewing our arrangements and our processes and our procedures. In actual fact, at the end of the month, there is a workshop where we will be looking at lessons learned from Fukushima. So I just want to say that certainly the city has taken cognizance of that. We want to be acting in a responsible way. And in collaboration with Eskom, we will be reviewing all current arrangements that we have in place. But for what it is, I will be speaking to you about our current arrangements that we have in place. The scope, the procedures are intended to cover those occurrences which have or potentially have radiological consequences to the general public, surrounding the Kuba nuclear power station. And I think when we speak about surrounding the nuclear power station, we speak here of the emergency planning zones. Now, the zones specifically, as has been mentioned by the other two speakers before me, we specifically focus, the whole area is called an emergency planning zone, and I will deal with that in detail later on. But we're particularly looking at the 0 to 5 kilometer radius around Kuba. And then there's another area called the 5 to 16 kilometer area, and that's the area that we focus on. But I will be detailing that more. So the big emphasis on the city's responsibility is the enactment of the protective actions. So that is to a large extent. Then we have legislation currently that deals with this. In the city's instance, it is the Disaster Management Act 57 of 2002. The Act as such provides for the establishment of a municipal disaster management center as per Section 43 of the Act. And in addition to that as well, the other legislation that plays off here is the National Nuclear Regulator Act of 1999. So these two pieces of legislation in South Africa impact actually on the arrangement here. So, like I said, I'm not here to speak on behalf of Kuburg. I'm here to speak on the city and our responsibility in terms of putting into play the protective actions in the event of a radiological accident or incident. It's important just to say this is the current classification that we have. The classification is an unusual event. It could be described as that. And the classification increases in severity. So it could be upgraded then to an alert, a site emergency, or general emergency. And I will look at the detail of this as we proceed through the presentation. Let me just say as well to you that we have regular exercises as such. We have in actual fact annual exercises. We first of all have the regulatory exercise, which is by the National Nuclear Regulator. This takes place every 2 years. And in actual fact, the successful passing of this particular exercise by all role players entitles Kuburg then to license their institution as such, to license the facility of the Kuburg nuclear power station. So this takes place every 2 years. We had the last one in 2012. Just after 2010, just after Soccer World Cup, FIFA World Cup. I think it was in November the 28th. That's when we had the last, I think, so it's due. And then, in addition to that, the nuclear power station as such has what we call a station exercise, and that's every alternate year. So the last station exercise that we had took place in November 2011. So you'll have a station exercise, and then it's followed up, by a regulatory exercise in terms of the National Nuclear Regulator Act. In these exercises that are simulated, you will find that there are two main control centers that are in operation. It is the Emergency Control Center of Kuburg. They are in communication with us, the City of Cape Town. The facility we use is called the Disaster Operations Center. We're out in Goodwood, and we're then in direct contact with them. In our instance, all applicable role players will report there on notification of a particular emergency. We normally will use SMSing as such as a way of alerting them. And key personnel of all the institutions, important role players such as the African National Defence Force, the province, South African Police Service, the Fire Service, etc., all role players, internal and external, then report to the Disaster Operations Center. And we then, in actual fact, activate the center as such, and we then in constant liaison and communication with the Emergency Control Center out in Kuburg. So this is our line of communication. Prior to this, I'm slightly digressing from my presentation, but I think it's just good that I give you the information. Prior to this, we made use of a manual system in terms of plotting the plume. And now approximately 2 years ago, we now have an electronic system, which has been funded by ESCOM, whereby we the plume and the maps and the information that's forthcoming is displayed electronically. So, and there are links now between our Disaster Operations Center and the Emergency Control Center of Kuburg. So that's a new addition. We can, however, on a fallback position, should you, for example, have a power outage and you cannot use it, you could then basically make use of the manual way of plotting the plume. So this is the arrangement that we basically have. Let's just go over to the next slide. An unusual event results in the notification of key ESCOM and local authority officials. And it normally steps up. If I look back at the exercises that we've had, it will normally, it could start as a site emergency, you know, but normally it will start as an unusual event that's reported, and the key personnel are just required to be on standby and to take note that this is happening, to prepare yourself. If it's then stepped up to the next, which is an alert, the alert it's an indication that there's something slightly more serious than just an unusual event. And again, a greater number of personnel are notified there. And in actual fact, we have a practice on an alert, we will activate both control centers. So both control centers will then be activated, and we'll get in key personnel as such. The next one is a site emergency, which is the third one. The site emergency indicates that it's progressive, and the situation now basically is problematic. But the situation is a site emergency, and by virtue of the title, it indicates it's confined to the 2.5 kilometer radius of the Koeberg nuclear power station. It hasn't gone off the premises of Koeberg. So within that fenced area of Koeberg, that is basically where you will have, it's declared a site emergency. And then, of course, like I said, at this stage, we already activated. The two control centers have been activated. We've been communicating. And we would have had a fair amount of information forthcoming at this stage. The general emergency is one where it goes beyond the borders now of the Koeberg nuclear power station, and it goes into the general public, and then you'll basically have a declaration of a general emergency, right? And it's gone. Like I say, it's gone beyond the boundaries of Koeberg, and this is basically the situation where you now have to notify your public of the situation. Now, I've heard it's important to hear just how other instances have handled, but I will deal with how we notify the public as it comes up on the slides. But that is the situation. The general emergency is the one that impacts on the general public out there. I'm not saying the others don't, but I'm trying to put into context how you have an escalation in terms of the various phases. Let me just go back to this one. Now, the notifications, as such, because this is actually will be coming up next, the notifications made are to all our emergency notifications, and they use the following channels of communication. The fixed siren and the public address system. Koeberg has invested, that is ESCOM has invested, in the installation of a fixed siren system within the 0 to 16 kilometer area. These are fixed sirens that will go off, they blare. They also have exercises, and I think early this year we also have notification where they tell the public that they will basically be having a test. So the public are alerted to it, and the siren will basically blare. It also, with the system, you have a public address system. It can be operated from the emergency control center at Koeberg. It can also be operated from the disaster operations center of the city. So immediately then, if you go to a general emergency, coming back to the point I'm making here, you can then use this fixed siren and public address system to immediately tell the people in that emergency planning zone area of 0 to 16, what orders to follow, what protective actions you intend implementing. We also can make use of the Metro Police, the traffic and the law enforcement vehicles of the City of Cape Town that are fitted with public address systems. This is another fallback position. You can do that as well. And that's also something which is part of our planning. Broadcasts also pre-arrangements have already been made with the SABC on regional and national radio and TV, and in this instance we use 94.5 KFM as well as Good Hope. So they would be used as such to broadcast messaging to it. I take the point being made also in the one, we all have cell phones, and possibly this is something which we can look at as a review. And through that, the cell phone network is another way. I think you can then send bulk and mass SMSs. And I think you then also need to particularly look at how do you get the people staying within that zone, how do you get that bulk SMSs, So that will probably be what you would do, because you would not send it necessarily to everybody in Cape Town, but particularly that people within the emergency planning zone. So I think that's the point certainly that I will add as a lesson learned there that we can take up and review, and looking at sending bulk SMSs, because that's the way one communicates nowadays. Okay. I'm going to concentrate maybe on the protective actions. Now, there are 5 basic protective actions which can be implemented. These are the prerogative of the city. Now, the Koeberg emergency controller will recommend protective actions for us to implement. We have the discretion as such to review it. We can decide to implement or not to implement, but we have another built-in mechanism. When we basically have an emergency like this, and this is what we do during the exercises, I go to what they call a joint decision-making, and we have in actual fact an arrangement for this. There is normally a Department of Energy representative within my Disaster Operations Center who represents the National Department, and I also have a provincial representative of the Provincial Disaster Management Center with me. And there's although it's my prerogative as head of the center to implement it, I do a joint decision-making with him based on the facts and the figures and the information that we receive from the emergency controller from the Emergency Control Center of Koeberg. So that's, there is in actual fact a responsible manner in which you then immediately implement your protective actions. The protective actions that we're looking at are 5. They are the zone isolation, where you can physically block off an area. This is normally done by traffic officers, where you'd put up a roadblock. This is one of them, zone isolation. You could also look at sheltering, advising that the population should go inside their homes, put off the air conditioning, and just shut the doors and windows and prevent ventilation from going on. So that's one way of sheltering that that one who could implement immediately. Then there's also evacuation, where you have to remove the population from the area, and this is also this has to be done very sensibly. Now, and I'm going to say this to you. I just want to touch on the others. The use of thyroid prophylaxis. You heard Peter speak about potassium iodate. Eskom has in actual fact purchased stacks of this potassium iodate. We have it located in the North 16 area at very strategic zones, and they include places like fire stations. They include also municipal clinics, and they are there. There is, of course, also the aspect which was done many years back when Koeberg initially started. The city insisted, in actual fact, in a situation of giving it to them prior to the incident. I'm just struggling now with the word. If it's done basically before and it's not done on the day. But this has also been a problem. Our experience has shown that these tablets as such gets misplaced over the years, and people don't have them. So we've gone back to the system now of saying that the best is probably just having them within the North 16 area at strategic places. This is possibly the best. Again, one is open to it, One of the things also that you said, Peter, is the chemists, and I think that's also an area of review that one could take place, is to actually make use of your pharmacies as such, where they can in actual fact also be looked upon as areas where you can have distribution points. So that's certainly something one can look at. But I think the point that we have learned is that the potassium iodate is not something which is regularly available. It's made on mass production. And I think one needs to look at that as well. It needs to be taken under review. So, I take the point that you make. The other one, of course, is also food banning, as has been indicated. And this is one that's implemented by our health department, environmental health practitioners. And we would have found food banning automatically in that area, should that be. So those are it. Now, how you implement these protective actions, the 5 I've mentioned, would depend on a combination of things. You would have to take into account the weather conditions that are prevailing at that point in time, and which way the wind is playing. And so depending, and also, for example, the dosage of radioactive material that has been released. So this all will be it, and you need very careful thought in terms of what protective actions as such you implement. So there's good, careful and consideration has to be given in terms of the protective actions that you will implement. It's not taken very lightly. It has to be done in a very responsible way, and you have to communicate as well to the people. So that's the arrangement that we have as such, in place. I think I think another one which is not mentioned in those 5 is just the fact that you notify the public. That is also a protective action. Just the fact that you notify the general public of the impending emergency. That is a protective action, because they are informed as such. And you do that via, like I said, the media. We can do it via the cell phones, etc. That is also a projective action, so that people know what is happening and you keep them informed. I want to say to you this morning, I don't speak here purely just from a point of view of the Kubrick Nuclear Emergency Plan, which is one of many plans that we implement. I also speak here from a disaster management perspective where we look at all issues. And one of the lessons that we've certainly learned from the city's perspective is to keep the public informed. And I think you will, and I will make this acknowledgement, in terms of the way we daily report from the city and we keep the public informed, we find that that is the best way to keep them updated and to give them the factual information. And I cannot see us deviating from this. This has been our practice in the city of Cape Town. We've done it. We have a track record in terms of the way we report, and we certainly will continue to do this even in this type of emergency. Because it's important for me, and I've realized that also, it's important that you have an informed public out there, that they know and you keep them every step of the way what is happening. I spoke about the emergency planning zones, and I just want to indicate to you here that the whole area from north to 16 is known as emergency planning zones, but they're subdivided into two that we take specific notice of. It's the precautionary action zone, which is from north to 5 kilometers. And I just want to deal a bit more about this later on. In the National Nuclear Regulator regulations as such, there's particular stipulations in terms of development in that area. For example, within the north to 5, because it could impact on evacuation, no development is in actual fact permitted, okay? Because it could impact on your traffic evacuation as such, and it could impact also on the ability of people in terms of your infrastructure that you have to evacuate. So there's no, except place bound. Now place bound basically means in the regulation, place bound refers to any addition to the nuclear power station. So, you know, Cuba could expand as such, but anything else. Now, we also, I think before I want to go to this, I think I want to mention the next area, of course, is the 5 to 16 kilometer area, the urgent protective planning zone. That's less of an impact, but it's also still important within that zone. Now here, they do permit, and this is what the regulations say, you can permit development here, but it's dependent on you having sufficient disaster management infrastructure in place. Now, for the sake of this, and I think I'm going to just go slightly, this is not a very good map. I have another map also, Peter, if we can bring it up, the larger one. But I think just for the sake of this, and you've dealt with it, this is the north to 5, this is the 5 kilometers, so that's the area of the protected action zone. And the urgent protected action zone, this next one is 16 kilometers over here. Okay, so those are the two zones just there. But I want to go to the next slide, in actual fact, where we look at the evacuation times. In the regulations that I've referred to in my presentation, the National Nuclear Regulations as such, you are required to evacuate people within the north to 5 kilometer zone within 4 hours. So you have 4 hours after you have issued the evacuation order to get them out of that zone. Okay? Similarly, in the 5 to 16 kilometer area, you basically have to get them out within a time frame of 16 hours after the outfall. So what has actually happened is we have undertaken now in 2006, when the National Nuclear Regulator published these regs and brought these stipulations, because of what was happening basically in the area out north here, in the Blauberg area, was you had a lot of developments taking place. And the developments basically meant that it could impact on evacuation times. And the National Nuclear Regulator therefore brought out these stipulations. What the city had to do was undertake a traffic evacuation model. A traffic evacuation model, or a TEM, was basically a study that was undertaken by an independent group of transportation specialist engineers, HHO, Hawkins and Osborne. And they undertook a study of the population and the development within that area then. And they had to indicate to us, as such, to various modeling, that the population there, you could get them out within that times, right? Now, we were told at that stage, when the modeling was undertaken, that it could be done, and that the people could be evacuated within 4 hours in north to 5 kilometer area. That this is what the model showed. And you could also basically do it within 16 hours in the UPZ area 5 to 16. we weren't satisfied. The city wasn't satisfied in actual fact. Well, I particularly wasn't satisfied, and I wanted to have it endorsed. So we had another independent service provider with the name of Nidnam Shan undertake it and test this as such. Okay? So this went through, and they then voiced the opinion. They backed and they confirmed that the findings of Hawkins and Osborne was in place, and as such, the population was of such of a density that you could adequately evacuate. Now, this is constantly under review. It's not something that is static. It's something that, because the population is ever going through. And from this, what you may not be aware of, when developments take place within this area, within the city, from a town planning perspective, we in actual fact have to give comment from the disaster management as one of the departments as to how it impacts on the Kuba nuclear emergency plan and the traffic evacuation model. So we've got to give, if it adds to the population and it gets to a stage where it could endanger people, we've had to say no. So many applications as such, we've tended to turn down applications for development because of the criteria as such. Now, this is of course annoyed some developers as such, you know, but that has been unfortunate because one has got to look at this. Now, what has happened is to update this because between town planning, as well as other departments in terms of new developments, we've had to keep pace as such, particularly in the Parklands area and Sunningdale, etc. And what we've done there is there's now at a regular interval on an annual basis, the city updates this, and we have a transportation engineer within our roads transport and roads department that updates this, and they collate all the information, the statistical information of the developments as such, and it goes through basically a model. It's modeled basically to see if it's, and thus far it's indicated that you can basically evacuate within those areas. So this has been tested. The results as such are given then to the national nuclear regulators as such. I think what I want to just mention is other things that's just worthy of note here is there are various structures within governing us within the Kuba Nuclear Emergency Plan. We have an emergency planning committee which meets quarterly, 4 times a year. This consists of various role players. Coburg is represented on the ESCOM, the city, SANDF, all the multiple role players that I mentioned earlier, they are represented there. And there are various working groups within the Emergency Planning Committee that looks at various issues, which could be things like protective actions like potassium iodide, distribution, the network, all that is looked at and council looked at, and even public education and awareness. These are all working groups that are functional. We also have another oversight committee called EPSOC. The acronym is Emergency Planning Steering and Oversight Committee, which is chaired by the National Nuclear Regulator, and it oversees the Emergency Planning Committee, which is chaired by the city. And all the new developments as such has to go through this particular committee, and it's looked at and it's challenged as such in terms of, you know, would that particular addition to that development, would it impact, what its impact would be on evacuation as such, and would you meet at evacuation time? So I think I want to just reassure you there is a stringent look at how, you know, of us keeping in this evacuation times in sync as such. Another forum which you may be aware of, it's called the Public Safety Information Forum. It's going to be meeting on the 29th of this month. It's held also on a quarterly basis by Coburg, and that's your interaction where Coburg basically, and ESCOM as such, interacts with the public on various issues of the Kuba nuclear power station. It's in actual fact particularly meant for the people residing within the north to 16-kilometer area zone. So all residents in that area, that's their way of interacting with them and bringing home this. And the other thing, I just have one, I'm just far away from my brief, but Kuba also publishes a calendar as such, and the calendar is distributed to people living within the north to 16-kilometer area. And this gives you an outline of the Kuba nuclear emergency plan. It tells you, for example, when dates are planned for sirens, for the exercises, etc. All that is mentioned in there. And what you should do, the do's and don'ts that you should do in the event of a nuclear emergency. So there has been also an effort, I must just say, to try and communicate this. And the best way is probably a calendar or with a magnet there that you can put up on your fridge, and you have free access to this. So this is also, one of the ways that we've tried to do that. I don't think there's anything else I wanted to add. I think I've covered most of them. I can probably go out in the more detail. I'll just give you an overview, Peter. I just thought that's important at this stage, and the detail. You did speak to me particularly about the evacuation. The evacuation would be, in the study that came out by Hawkins, Osborne, where it was looked at, people probably will self-evacuate. If you're looking at the people as such, they will self-evacuate, they'll take their own motor vehicles, they'll drive out of the area, okay? You also have to cater for people who are not in that situation. I'm talking about possibly old age homes and pensioners, etc., who can't move. In this instance, you're going to have to probably looking at ambulances being used to transport them, okay? Then for the other masses and the impoverished communities staying out there, and I'm particularly looking at people like Atlantis, etc., you probably will have to look at mass transportation with buses. We have an agreement in place with Golden Arrow Transport Service to do that, cabs, the bus service to do that. They have also, fortuitously for us, they have in actual fact also a depot based out of Atlantis, where you can in actual fact use people for mass transportation. A very interesting development which you still have to factor into for the city side. We now have the IRT bus system of the city that has come into play, and that's an additional way of evacuation. Ideally, what we would like to see is the railway line that's been created there, which is basically a goods railway line that is activated, and it's another way that you can basically use for evacuation. So that we see as an infrastructure with potential that could be used as evacuation. And we're trying to moot that as well, so that it just gives you another option as such. I think what I want to just say there is that we're wanting to factor in now how we could use the IRT system again, because that's a spin-off now that has come, and that can be factored into the plan, and it gives you another source of, and it can be used for, and we certainly mentioned that to our transportation engineers, that this is a factored thing we'd like to look at, and that needs to still be factored now into the traffic evacuation model. Up to this point, it has not been, but I'm just mentioning that. So these are just things that we are looking at. I just made a couple of notes here. I think I've covered basically all. So, Peter, to come back to your point, what will happen in the event of evacuation? Our procedures there, I think it's 4.4, provides basically for the self-evacuation, taking care of people who have special needs, such as old age homes, etc., via ambulance transport with emergency medical services. And then, of course, the mass transportation as well, and people being advised to go out, communicating with them via the siren, not the siren system, but the public address system that's there, where they need to be, and then evacuating them as such with this. They will be taken to mass care centers. The mass care centers as such, we've already pre-identified. Oh yeah, this is the word I lost, but I couldn't get to. I meant to say the pre-issuing of potassium iodide tablets. That's the word I was looking for earlier, and I just stumbled for that. But that, like I said to you earlier, has its problems as well. People misplace this, or it's not put into a safe place. They lose track of it. So the pre-issuing is not necessarily looked upon favorably. It has its pluses and negatives as well. But just coming back to the point I had made, they will go to mass care centers. Such we have pre-identified mass care centers within the city where we could take these people when they get to a mass care center, and we've done the simulation, because when we do the exercise, we have a number of the exercise takes place under highly controlled circumstances. We are open to scrutiny, and people will come to the emergency control center at the Kuba nuclear plant. They will come to our control center. What we do, the actions, the protection actions I implement as I action them, that's all taken notice. So you'll find as such if I could use it for a better word, the umpires that come around as part of it. And normally the umpires are composed, as far as we are told, it's normally international representation as well. So they come around here, and we open to scrutiny everything that we do. One of the things that we actually simulate as well is in actual fact a mass care center. What do we do? How do we take over? What do we do in terms of decontamination? Because when people come off these buses, if they're coming in, they immediately then goes to the dosimeters, it's picked it up, and if as such, we go through decontamination process, where they are stripped down and that is done. And then they are given alternative clothing. And then our other departments, like the health department, with our environmental health practitioners, our housing department that does the sheltering, that all is then taken care of. So we've simulated this. Dave, in actual fact, I can just say to you, one of the criticisms that we had in one of the exercises that we had in previous years was we had to simulate how we did this practically. And the fire department had to show, for example, that when you had a runoff, that the runoff as such, as you hose people off or they were showered, that runoff is contained and doesn't go into your normal drainage system. So that also had to be looked at, and we had to, in the last one that we had now, in November last year, we particularly invited the NNR, National Nuclear Regulator, to look at this and how we had made provision. One of the positive things of FIFA World Cup was, from a radioactive nuclear perspective, we had found that the SANDF had invested a lot of money in preparedness for terrorist activity that could have impacted. Now we've piggybacked on that, and with the equipment they've assisted our fire service as such. So that money that has been spent on equipment, etc., to look at a terrorist sort of attack during 2020 is now being put to good use, because they have, good equipment at hand, and this we've also now engaged with. So I think I want to leave you with a point: we're open to learning. I just want to share with you certainly what we are doing from the city side. We are open to learning, and I think one never learns enough. I personally, just as an individual, I'm a lifelong student. I believe in learning daily. That is why I took up the opportunity to come here today. I think what you might not have shared with them, Peter, was there was this debate whether I should come or should not come. And I decided that I should do the responsible thing. I should come here because we have nothing to hide. We believe we are the city and we are here to serve you, and we're trying to do the best in the circumstances. I feel in that way I can gain as well with my perspective and my knowledge, and I take the inputs that I've been given here, and certainly we can improve in what we have been doing. So I thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Greg, and for being here as well once again. I think whether we like the idea of a nuclear power plant or not, what we do all need to acknowledge is we have one. We have one 28 k's away, and that means we need an effective emergency response services, which means we should cooperate with each other as much as possible. You mentioned that there's a calendar that goes out. And I think that calendar does raise a lot of questions as well as answer one. I know one point on it, it says, do not collect your children from school. And I wonder how many parents are going to follow that advice if they know their children are in danger. You also mentioned that things are open to scrutiny. What we've asked for is a copy of the emergency and evacuation plan. And I know that's not your department, that's legal department, but it's been turned down, and we've been told to go through a legal process if we want access to that. So it's difficult for me to reconcile that response with what you're saying, but I'm sure those questions will come out later. I think there are a lot of questions that came to my mind as well. For example, if you evacuate 100,000 people, do you have clothing for 100,000 people to replace their clothing, and how exactly would that work, for example? And also a burning question for me is, how long is this plan? Is it a 6-month plan? Is it a 25-year plan? And we've heard that perhaps it needs to be a plan that extends over a long time.